All right, let's look at COM 400, Chapter 9 today, experimentation. And we're going to look at different aspects of experiments. We've talked about experiments in the past, but today we are going to look at specifically how they're different than some of the other things. Sometimes we call surveys experiments, but actually that's a little bit different. Sometimes they are experiments, and sometimes we just think of them as close to experiments, and they are closer to experiments than qualitative, but still may not be exactly what experimental research is. Let's take a look at what it is and where it came from. Experimental research has risen in popularity recently. People like it a lot for a number of reasons. There are four advantages we'll look at. The first is evidence of causality. One of the reasons it's been so popular is that if you do the experiment right, if you use the right statistics, you can show evidence that it was caused by something else. Now, if you use other kinds of statistics, such as correlation, you can't show that causality. But with experiments, for the last 100 years, people have seen that experiments actually can show that one thing seems to have caused something else. So evidence of causality is really important. Experiments, therefore, help establish cause and effect. Weird thing, the idea of that you needed time for cause and effect to happen wasn't thought about until about the 1800s as far as science is concerned. And the idea is that if you look at something in time, and you have a record of what's happening, you can see that if one event happened and then another event happened, the first event may have caused the second, and you use time to make sure that happened. If something happens after the event, you know that it didn't cause it. So cause effects and effect is really important. It's more powerful than any other kind of research. Now, while cause and effect cannot be proven, the experiment comes the closest. Yesterday I was reviewing a paper, and they said that something was proved, that this demonstrated it showed, and in fact there was support for that idea, but it never actually proved it. In science, it's best not to say something was proven. They do that when in advertisements and things like that, and in common life, but when you're talking about levels of proof and things like that in science, it's best not to use that. Now, the time is controlled so that it's possible to see if cause precedes effect. The You want to make sure that one happened before the other, and with research data that is taking into account time, you can see if that actually happens. If you just are seeing whether one thing happens a lot of times when another thing happens, you don't know which is causing which. Some other variables also are controllable, and you'll notice we use the word control a lot because that's an important part of an experiment. Other variables are also controllable. Take a look at those. We talked about time being controllable, and we're going to talk about those other elements now as we talk about control. Laboratory research allows researchers to isolate a testing situation. That means they take out all of the other things that might be causing something and just introduce one possible cause. And if that makes something occur, then they know it's not a lot of other things. So researchers isolate a testing situation from the competing influences of normal activity. So that's why you might be, if you're trying to get an experiment on why you can't sleep at night. In Baton Rouge, there was a place where they had a sleep laboratory, and you can go in and they would hook things up to your head, and you would sleep, and they would measure all kinds of things to try to figure out why you were having a hard time sleeping. Now, some things you can control are light, temperature, also, proximity to testing instruments can be precisely controlled. So all of those things may affect something, and so all of those things can be controlled to make sure you know exactly what is influencing an action. The numbers and types of independent and dependent variables can be controlled. Now let's go back a minute and talk about independent and dependent variables, just different kinds of variables, separating the variable that changes and the variable that causes the change. So if you were to put fertilizer on a plant, that would be the one causing the fertilizer would be the independent variable, and the dependent variable would be plant growth that depends on the fertilizer. So you can control those things to find out what is happening. Right now we have people working on a coronavirus vaccine, and you can bet they're looking at all different kinds of ways of controlling this. There was one sample from Brazil that was being looked at, and they found that it was actually the side effects were very dangerous, so they shut it down. They actually couldn't control the side effects, so they had to shut it down so more people wouldn't be hurt. The selection process of the sample can be more tightly controlled. Now, there's some drawbacks of that, but you can, for instance, if you were doing a lab experiment, you could make sure that the subject that you are selecting is exactly a certain way. Usually you're using fewer subjects. As usually a characteristic of a experiment, so it can be more tightly controlled. The third thing is cost, and the cost can be low. Now, I kind of premise that because it can be low because it might be one lab and you might have a few subjects. So sometimes the cost is low. However, sometimes it can be expensive. There are some experiments where you might need an MRI, magnetic resonance imaging machine. Maybe you're charting to see how certain messages affect the brain, if certain parts of the brain change during that time. Or maybe you're using an EKG, an electronic encephalogram, and they might attach things to your head to see what parts of your brain light up when you see certain messages. Those would be much more expensive. An MRI system can be cost millions of dollars. So while the cost can be low, it can be high as well. But it's cheaper to use the low numbers of subjects used in experiments. An experiment might have just a few people. There was a big one talked about, a big supposedly study that somebody talked about on the news, and it was happening in Brazil. I believe the number was under 50. Turned out there were only about 46, I think, people involved in the study, and but that would be okay in an experiment. That was the study that was shut down. So you do have lower numbers in experiments. And number 4 is replication. You might have seen the movie Replicant, where this alien changes forms into different things or simulates different things. And that's what replication kind of is in research. In regard to replication, the experiment allows for duplication of procedures. So you can do the experiment a second time. And this is pretty valuable because if maybe somebody didn't wash the bottles well the first time and there was a contaminant that actually caused a particular effect, then the second time you do it, you should be able to rule that out. So the experiment allows for duplication of procedures, and that's very important in science to see if something was researched well.